They saw a young woman in her 20s, alone and seemingly vulnerable. Intelligence reports labeled her as low priority, just another civilian caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The enemy pilots received their orders with casual confidence. Eliminate the target, secure the airspace, return to base. What could go wrong? But beneath that unassuming exterior was Lydia Litviak, a name that would soon strike terror into the hearts of experienced German aviators. She wasn't just any woman. She was a weapon disguised in human form, with reflexes sharper than a falcon and a mind that calculated death trajectories faster than their advanced targeting systems. In just 18 minutes of aerial combat, she would transform from an easy mark into their worst nightmare, sending 7 Luftwaffe aircraft spiraling toward the earth in twisted metal and flames. This is the story of how the most underestimated pilot in World War II turned the skies into a graveyard for those who dared to underestimate her. The enemy thought they knew what they were hunting. They were dead wrong. The morning of August 13, 1943 began like any other at the Stalingrad airfield. Soviet mechanics worked frantically to prepare aircraft while pilots grabbed whatever breakfast they could find. Among them stood a figure that didn't quite fit the typical image of a combat aviator. Lydia Litviak was barely 5 feet tall, with blonde hair that caught the early sunlight, and a face that belonged more in a university classroom than a military briefing room. At just 21 years old, Lydia had already earned a reputation among her fellow Soviet pilots, but to the outside world she remained largely unknown. The German intelligence network had files on most of the dangerous Soviet aces, thick folders filled with combat records, tactical analyses, and explicit orders to avoid engagement when possible. Lydia's file was remarkably thin, a few grainy photographs, basic biographical information, and a threat assessment that read simply minimal risk, engage with standard protocols. This assessment would prove to be one of the most fatal miscalculations of the war. Born in Moscow in 1921, Lydia had discovered her passion for flying at 14 when she joined a local aviation club. While other girls her age were learning traditional feminine skills, she was mastering aerodynamics and aircraft mechanics. Her instructors quickly recognized something extraordinary in this quiet, determined young woman. She didn't just fly aircraft, she became one with them, understanding their capabilities and limitations with an intuitive grasp that took most pilots years to develop. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Lydia was among the first women to volunteer for combat duty. The Soviet Union, desperate for pilots, was more willing than other nations to accept female aviators. However, even within the progressive Soviet military structure, women pilots faced skepticism and discrimination. Many male pilots viewed them as publicity stunts or potential liabilities in combat situations. Lydia's first combat mission had been a sobering experience. Flying an older Yak, one fighter that had seen better days, she encountered a formation of German bombers, escorted by experienced Messerschmitt fighters. The enemy pilots, upon identifying her as a solo female pilot through radio intercepts, had actually laughed over their communications. One German pilot was heard saying, "Let's have some fun with the little bird." That attitude lasted exactly 37 seconds. When the engagement ended, 2 German aircraft were destroyed, and Lydia had suffered only minor damage to her wingtip. The surviving German pilots filed a report describing the encounter as an attack by an unknown ace pilot of exceptional skill. They never mentioned that their adversary had been a young woman flying alone. As weeks turned to months, Lydia's combat record grew steadily. She developed tactics that maximized the strengths of Soviet aircraft while exploiting the overconfidence of German pilots. She learned to use their prejudices against them, often allowing enemy pilots to believe they had gained an advantageous position before executing devastating counterattacks. Her aircraft became a symbol of hope for Soviet ground troops. Mechanics painted white lilies on the nose of her fighter, earning her the nickname White Lily. But more importantly, she began to attract the attention of German intelligence officers who were trying to understand why their experienced pilots kept reporting encounters with an exceptional enemy aviator in sectors where no such pilot was supposed to exist. The truth was that Lydia had developed into something far more dangerous than a skilled pilot. She had become a student of warfare itself, analyzing every engagement, studying the psychology of her enemies, and constantly refining her approach to aerial combat. She understood that in the cockpit of a fighter aircraft, gender, size, and age meant nothing. What mattered was intelligence, reflexes, and the ruthless application of tactical knowledge. By the summer of 1943, she had accumulated 12 confirmed kills, a number that placed her among the most successful Soviet pilots of either gender. However, her greatest challenge was yet to come. German forces were planning a major offensive in the Stalingrad sector, and intelligence reports suggested they were assigning their most experienced pilots to clear the skies of Soviet resistance. On August 12th, the day before what would become her most famous battle, Lydia received a briefing that chilled even experienced pilots. German reconnaissance flights had identified Soviet defensive positions, and a massive air assault was planned for the following morning. The attack would involve elite Luftwaffe squadrons, flying the newest and most advanced German fighters. Soviet commanders made a difficult decision. Rather than risk their experienced pilots in what would certainly be a fierce engagement, they would send their newer aviators to gain combat experience while using their aces strategically. Lydia, despite her growing reputation, was still officially classified as a developing pilot due to military bureaucracy that failed to recognize her true capabilities. She was assigned to fly a solo reconnaissance mission during the German assault, with orders to observe and report enemy formations rather than engage in combat. The mission was considered relatively safe, as German pilots would presumably be focused on their primary objectives rather than chasing a single reconnaissance aircraft. As she prepared her aircraft that evening, Lydia knew the mission briefing didn't tell the whole story. Her instincts, honed by months of combat experience, warned her that tomorrow would be different. The Germans were planning something significant, and she had a feeling that her routine reconnaissance mission would become anything but routine. Her mechanic, a grizzled veteran named Sergei who had worked on aircraft since the early days of Soviet aviation, noticed her unusually thorough pre-flight inspection. "You're checking everything twice tonight," he observed. "Something bothering you?" Lydia looked up from the engine compartment where she had been examining every bolt and connection. "Just a feeling," she replied. "Tomorrow feels different. Important." Sergei nodded knowingly. He had worked with enough combat pilots to recognize the instincts that kept them alive. "Your ammunition is loaded with a mix of armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds," he told her. "And I made sure your fuel tanks are completely full. Whatever happens tomorrow, you'll be ready." As night fell over the airfield, Lydia made her final preparations. She studied maps of the sector, memorizing every geographical feature that might provide tactical advantages. She reviewed recognition silhouettes of German aircraft, focusing on the newest models that had been appearing in intelligence reports. Most importantly, she'd mentally rehearsed the combat maneuvers that had kept her alive through previous engagements. Other pilots slept fitfully, knowing that dawn would bring danger, but Lydia felt a strange calm settling over her. She had prepared as thoroughly as possible, and now everything depended on her ability to execute under pressure. As she finally closed her eyes for a few hours of rest, her last thought was a simple resolve. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would be ready to meet it. The German pilots, who were already airborne, flying night patrols in preparation for the morning assault, had no idea that their intelligence assessments were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. They were expecting to encounter minimal resistance from an outnumbered and outgunned Soviet Air Force. Instead, they were about to face a pilot who would redefine their understanding of aerial warfare. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become legendary in the annals of military aviation, though few people alive at the time could have predicted the stunning outcome that awaited with the sunrise. Dawn broke over the Eastern Front with deceptive tranquility. The air was crisp and clear, offering perfect visibility for aerial operations. At the German forward airbase, located just 40 miles from the front lines, activity had begun before sunrise. Ground crews worked efficiently in the pre-dawn darkness, fueling aircraft and loading ammunition while pilots attended their final briefing. Squadron leader Heinrich Müller stood before a map-covered wall, addressing 12 of Germany's most experienced fighter pilots. These men represented the elite of the Luftwaffe, veterans who had collectively accumulated over 300 aerial victories across multiple theaters of war. Their aircraft, newly delivered Messerschmitt Bf-109G fighters, represented the pinnacle of German aviation technology. "Gentlemen," Müller began, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never lost an aerial engagement. "Today's operation is straightforward. Soviet forces have been weakened by our recent offensives, and intelligence indicates their air resistance will be minimal. Our primary objective is to establish complete air superiority over the Stalingrad sector while providing support for ground operations." He pointed to various locations on the map, each marked with different colored pins. "Red markers indicate confirmed Soviet airfields, most of which have been damaged by previous raids. Blue markers show suspected aircraft positions, though reconnaissance suggests most are non-operational. Yellow markers represent anti-aircraft positions, which remain a concern." One of the younger pilots, Lieutenant Klaus Weber, raised his hand. "Sir, what about enemy fighter resistance? Our last engagement reported contact with a skilled pilot who managed to damage 2 of our aircraft." Mueller's expression remained dismissive. "Intelligence has thoroughly analyzed that incident. The pilot in question appears to be either exceptionally lucky or flying an aircraft with performance characteristics that don't match known Soviet capabilities. Regardless, one pilot cannot significantly impact our operation. We will be flying in formation with overwhelming numerical superiority. What the German intelligence network failed to understand was that they had been analyzing fragments of different engagements, each involving the same pilot but filed as separate incidents. The pattern of tactical innovation and exceptional marksmanship that characterized Lydia's combat record had been attributed to multiple different pilots, creating a false impression of dispersed talent rather than concentrated expertise. As the German pilots made their final preparations, Lydia was conducting her own mission briefing 40 miles away. Her orders were clear but limited: conduct reconnaissance of the eastern sector, identify enemy formations, and report back to headquarters. Under no circumstances was she to engage in combat unless directly threatened. However, as Lydia studied the morning intelligence reports, she noticed patterns that her commanders had missed. German radio traffic had increased significantly during the night, suggesting a major operation was planned. Weather conditions were perfect for air-to-ground attacks, and previous German tactics indicated they preferred to launch complex operations early in the morning to maximize daylight hours for multiple sorties. She approached her commanding officer, Major Volkov, with her analysis. "Sir, I believe we're about to face a significant German air assault. The reconnaissance mission should be modified to provide early warning of incoming formations." Volkov, a practical man who had learned to trust his pilot's instincts, considered her assessment. "What do you recommend?" "Allow me to fly a wider patrol pattern at higher altitude. If German formations are approaching, I can provide advance warning and detailed intelligence about their numbers and intentions. The current reconnaissance route is too limited to be effective." After consulting with other officers, Volkov approved the modified mission. "Remember, your primary objective is intelligence gathering. Avoid combat engagement unless absolutely necessary." As Lydia walked toward her aircraft, she reflected on the irony of her situation. The Germans considered her a minimal threat, while her own commanders saw her primarily as a reconnaissance asset. Both sides were about to discover that their assessments were fundamentally flawed. Her Yak, one fighter, had been meticulously maintained by Sergei and his team. The engine ran smoothly, all control surfaces responded properly, and her weapon systems had been tested and calibrated. As she completed her pre-flight inspection, Sergei approached with final checks. "Everything is perfect," he reported. "Full ammunition load, extra fuel tank installed, and I've made some unauthorized modifications to your radio equipment. You'll be able to monitor German frequencies as well as maintain contact with our base." Lydia smiled at his initiative. Sergei's modifications had previously provided valuable intelligence during combat engagements. "Thank you, my friend. If things go badly today, make sure the other pilots know what we learned." As she climbed into the cockpit, Lydia felt the familiar sensation of becoming one with her aircraft. Every pilot experienced this to some degree, but for her it had become something approaching mystical unity. The aircraft's responses became extensions of her own reflexes, its capabilities and limitations as familiar as her own physical abilities. At precisely 0630 hours, she taxied to the runway and received clearance for takeoff. One's engine roared as she advanced the throttle, and within seconds she was airborne, climbing steadily toward her assigned patrol altitude of 15,000 feet. Meanwhile, 12 German fighters had taken off from their base and were forming up for their approach to the Soviet sector. Their flight plan called for a high-altitude approach followed by a rapid descent to attack identified ground targets. Squadron leader Mueller led the formation, confident that any Soviet resistance would be quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers and tactics. As the German formation crossed into contested airspace, their radio operator began monitoring Soviet frequencies for signs of defensive preparations. What they heard was routine radio chatter suggesting normal operations rather than alert status. This intelligence reinforced their belief that they had achieved tactical surprise. Lydia, flying at maximum altitude and using cloud cover to mask her presence, spotted the incoming German formation while they were still 10 miles from their intended targets. 12 aircraft flying in tight formation. Definitely Messerschmitt fighters based on their silhouettes and flight characteristics. Their approach vector would take them directly over critical Soviet positions. She immediately radioed base with her findings. "Control. This is White Lily. 12 enemy fighters approaching from the northwest, at high altitude. Formation suggests attack mission rather than patrol. Estimate 5 minutes until they reach our positions." The response was immediate. "White Lily, maintain observation and continue reporting. Ground defenses are being alerted." As Lydia continued tracking the German formation, she realized that ground-based anti-aircraft defenses would be insufficient to stop 12 experienced pilots and modern fighters. The German attack would succeed unless someone intervened to disrupt their formation and tactics. Her orders were clear: reconnaissance only, avoid combat engagement. But as she watched the German aircraft begin their attack descent towards Soviet positions where hundreds of soldiers and civilians would be helpless against aerial assault, she faced a moral choice that transcended military orders. The German pilots focused on their attack approach had not yet detected her presence. She held every tactical advantage: altitude, surprise, and detailed knowledge of their intentions. But she was one pilot against 12, flying an older aircraft against superior technology. As the German formation continued its descent toward their targets, Lydia made her decision. She would engage the enemy formation not because her orders permitted it, but because the alternative was unacceptable. Sometimes the right choice was also the most dangerous one. She adjusted her radio to German frequencies and listened to their tactical communications. The pilots were casual and confident, discussing their attack runs with the relaxed professionalism of men who expected no serious opposition. One pilot commented, "This should be easier than training exercises." Lydia smiled grimly as she began her own descent, positioning herself for an attack approach that would maximize surprise and confusion within the German formation. The enemy thought they were hunting defenseless prey. Instead, they had stumbled into the territory of a predator who was about to teach them the difference between easy targets and hidden threats. The hunt was about to begin, but the roles of hunter and prey were not what anyone expected. The German formation maintained perfect discipline as they approached their target area. Squadron leader Mueller's voice crackled over the radio with calm professionalism. "Eagle flight. Begin attack descent. Maintain formation until we reach attack altitude. Remember, speed and surprise are our advantages." 12 Messerschmitt fighters began their coordinated dive toward the Soviet positions below. Their tactical plan was textbook perfect: approach at high altitude to avoid detection, dive rapidly to minimize exposure to ground fire, deliver concentrated attacks on identified targets, then climb back to altitude for a second pass if necessary. What they couldn't know was that their formation was being tracked by a pilot who had spent months studying German tactics and developing countermeasures. Lydia had positioned herself above and behind the German formation, using the sun's glare to mask her approach. Her Yak-1 was configured for maximum speed and maneuverability, with external fuel tanks jettisoned and weapons systems armed. As she monitored German radio communications, she learned valuable information about their attack priorities. The lead aircraft would target the main supply depot, while wingmen would focus on vehicle concentrations and defensive positions. This tactical intelligence gave her crucial insights into their flight paths and timing. German fighter tactics relied heavily on formation integrity and mutual support. Individual pilots were exceptionally skilled, but their strength came from coordinated attacks and overlapping defensive coverage. Lydia understood that disrupting this formation would transform their greatest advantage into a critical vulnerability. She selected her first target carefully, the rearmost aircraft in the formation, a position typically occupied by newer or less experienced pilots. This pilot would be focused primarily on maintaining formation position rather than scanning for threats, making him the most vulnerable to surprise attack. Lieutenant Weber, flying in the rear position, was indeed concentrating on keeping proper distance from his squadron leader. At 19 years old, he was the youngest pilot in the formation, and acutely aware of the responsibility of maintaining formation discipline during his first major operation. His attention was divided between his instruments, his position relative to other aircraft, and the ground targets becoming visible below. Lydia began her attack approach, diving from above and behind at maximum speed. The Yak-1's engine note changed as she advanced the throttle to combat power, but the sound was masked by the German aircraft engines and wind noise. Her approach angle was calculated to remain in Weber's blind spot until the last possible moment. The engagement mathematics were brutally simple. Weber's Messerschmitt was faster in level flight and had superior armament, but Lydia held the advantages of surprise, position, and timing. More importantly, she had combat experience while Weber was flying his first operational mission. At 300 yards range, Lydia opened fire with a short burst designed to test her weapon alignment and range estimation. Her armor-piercing rounds struck Weber's aircraft in the engine cowling, causing immediate smoke and vibration. The young German pilot's first indication of attack was the sound of cannon shells impacting his aircraft. Weber's training took over as he attempted to break formation and evade further damage. However, his evasive maneuvers were predictable. Following standard procedures taught in flight school, Lydia anticipated his movements and adjusted her attack accordingly, firing a longer burst that struck his fuel tank and flight controls. The Messerschmitt began losing altitude with engine failure and control damage. Weber transmitted a distress call. Eagle Leader, this is Eagle 12. I am hit and losing power. Unknown attacker from above. Squadron Leader Mueller's response was immediate and sharp. All aircraft, break formation and engage enemy fighter. Eagle 12. Attempt emergency landing if possible. The German formation dissolved as pilots turned to engage their attacker, but Lydia had already anticipated this response. Instead of remaining in the area to fight 11 remaining fighters, she had executed a high-speed diving escape that took her out of immediate danger while forcing the German pilots to choose between pursuing her and continuing their original mission. Mueller faced a tactical dilemma. Pursuing the Soviet fighter would require his entire formation to abandon their primary objective, potentially allowing other Soviet aircraft to respond or ground defenses to be alerted. However, allowing the attacker to escape meant accepting that their formation could be disrupted by a single enemy pilot. He made the decision that Lydia had hoped for. Eagle Flight. Reform on me. We complete the primary mission first, then deal with the fighter. This choice meant that the German pilots would continue their attack run while remaining vulnerable to further harassment. Lydia used the temporary respite to climb back to attack altitude and reassess the tactical situation. Weber's aircraft was descending in a controlled crash landing, effectively removing one enemy fighter from the engagement. The remaining 11 aircraft were reforming, but had lost the element of surprise and tactical initiative. More importantly, her attack had psychological impact beyond the physical damage. The German pilots now knew they were facing opposition, but they didn't know the source or extent of the threat. Radio chatter revealed confusion about the number of attackers, their capabilities, and their intentions. Eagle Leader, did anyone see how many fighters attacked Eagle 12? Asked one pilot. Negative. Appeared to be single aircraft, but confirmed visual contact before engagement. Muller replied. Lydia smiled grimly at this exchange. The Germans were already overestimating her numbers, a psychological advantage she intended to exploit. Single-pilot tactics against formation attacks required creating the impression of multiple threats to maximize confusion and defensive reactions. As the German formation resumed its attack approach, now more cautiously and with heightened alertness, Lydia planned her second engagement. The element of complete surprise was gone, but she retained advantages of position and initiative. Her next target would need to be selected more carefully, as the German pilots were now actively scanning for threats. She noticed that one German pilot had become separated from the main formation during the confusion following her first attack. This aircraft, flying slightly ahead and to the left of the main group, presented an opportunity for another surprise engagement before the pilot could rejoin the formation. Hauptmann Fischer, the separated pilot, was a veteran with significant combat experience. However, his position isolated him from immediate support while his attention was divided between rejoining the formation and scanning for the Soviet fighter. His experience was both an advantage and a disadvantage. He understood aerial combat tactics, but also followed predictable patterns that Lydia had studied. She positioned herself for a beam attack, approaching from the side rather than from behind. This approach was more dangerous because it exposed her aircraft to return fire, but it also maximized the probability of achieving critical damage with a short engagement. The beam attack required precise timing and exceptional marksmanship. Lydia would have only seconds to engage before Fischer could respond with his own weapons. Her success depended on accuracy, surprise, and the ability to disengage before other German fighters could support their colleague. At 200 yards range, Lydia opened fire with a concentrated burst aimed at Fischer's cockpit and engine areas. The veteran pilot reacted instantly, attempting to turn into the attack while returning fire, but Lydia had anticipated this response and adjusted her aim accordingly. Her shells struck Fischer's aircraft in the wing root and cockpit area, causing immediate structural damage and wounding the pilot. Fischer's aircraft rolled out of control as he struggled with damaged flight controls and injury, his own return fire missing Lydia's rapidly maneuvering fighter. Eagle Leader, this is Eagle 7. I am hit and losing control. Soviet fighter is extremely aggressive and accurate. Fischer transmitted through gritted teeth as he fought to maintain consciousness and aircraft control. The German formation now faced a crisis. Two experienced pilots had been shot down or severely damaged by an unknown number of Soviet fighters in less than 3 minutes. The attack mission was falling apart, and Squadron Leader Mueller had to decide whether to continue the operation or abort and deal with the fighter threat. Lydia didn't give him time for careful consideration. As the German pilots struggled to reform their scattered formation and locate their attackers, she was already positioning for her third engagement. Her tactics were working exactly as planned: create maximum confusion, inflict steady losses, and force the enemy into reactive rather than proactive decision-making. The sky above the Stalingrad sector had become a deadly chess game, with Lydia moving her single piece against the German formation like a grandmaster exploiting an opponent's weaknesses. Each move created new opportunities while limiting enemy options, building toward a conclusion that none of the participants could yet envision. The German pilots were discovering that their numerical superiority meant nothing if they couldn't coordinate effectively or predict their opponent's actions. They were being systematically destroyed by a pilot who understood that aerial combat was ultimately about intelligence and tactics rather than numbers and technology. Squadron leader Muller's voice carried an edge of frustration as he attempted to regain control of the rapidly deteriorating situation. All Eagle aircraft form defensive circle. Maintain visual contact with wingmen. We are dealing with a highly skilled opponent who must be eliminated before we can complete the primary mission. The surviving German pilots began executing a classic defensive formation, but Lydia had anticipated this response. Defensive circles were effective against multiple attackers but created predictable flight paths that a single, highly maneuverable fighter could exploit. As the German aircraft began their circular pattern, she positioned herself to attack from unexpected angles. Her third target was Lieutenant Hartmann, an experienced pilot flying wingman to one of the formation leaders. Hartmann had noticed the pattern in the previous attacks. The Soviet pilot preferred to strike isolated or separated aircraft rather than engaging the main formation directly. He deliberately positioned his aircraft as apparent bait, hoping to lure the attacker into range of supporting fighters. It was a sound tactical concept that might have worked against a conventional opponent. However, Lydia recognized the trap and decided to turn it against its creator. Instead of attacking Hartmann directly, she would use his position to create an opportunity for multiple engagements. She began a high-speed diving attack that appeared to target Hartmann's aircraft, causing him and his supporting fighters to turn into the attack as planned. But at the last moment, Lydia rolled inverted and pulled through the defensive formation, opening fire on a different aircraft entirely while using her speed to avoid the converging defensive fire. Her shells struck Oberleutnant Schneider's fighter just as he was turning to support Hartmann. The surprise attack caught Schneider with his aircraft in a vulnerable turn, exposing his full profile to Lydia's guns. The concentrated fire destroyed his engine and severed control cables, sending his Messerschmitt into an uncontrollable spin. Eagle 4 is going down. Schneider transmitted as he prepared to abandon his aircraft. Soviet pilot anticipated our defensive pattern. This is not a standard pilot. Repeat, not a standard pilot. The psychological impact of Schneider's warning rippled through the German formation. These were veteran pilots who had faced the best the Soviet Union could offer, but they were encountering something entirely unexpected, a pilot who seemed to anticipate their tactics and turn their own strengths against them. Mueller made the difficult decision that Lydia had been maneuvering him toward all aircraft, abandon defensive formation, break into pairs and hunt this fighter aggressively. We cannot allow one pilot to disrupt our entire mission. This was exactly what Lydia wanted. By forcing the Germans to abandon their disciplined formation tactics and resort to individual combat, she had eliminated their primary advantage while playing to her own strengths. Individual dogfights favored the pilot with superior situational awareness and tactical flexibility. As the German aircraft dispersed to hunt for their tormentor, Lydia climbed to maximum altitude and assessed her situation. 4 German fighters had been eliminated or severely damaged, leaving 8 operational aircraft scattered across the engagement area. Her ammunition was approximately half depleted, and fuel consumption from high-power combat maneuvering had reduced her endurance significantly. More importantly, the German pilots were becoming increasingly desperate and aggressive. Desperate opponents were dangerous because they took risks that rational tactical analysis would normally prevent. She would need to be even more careful with her subsequent engagements. 2 German fighters flown by experienced pilots Hauptmann Berg and Lieutenant Hoffmann had coordinated their search pattern to cover overlapping areas while maintaining mutual support distance. They represented the most dangerous remaining threat because they were working together effectively rather than flying as individuals. Berg had correctly analyzed the tactical situation. Hoffmann, this Soviet pilot is using our numbers against us by forcing us into reactive postures. We need to create a situation where he must come to us instead of choosing his own engagement terms. Their solution was to position themselves over the original target area and begin strafing Soviet ground positions. This would force the Soviet fighter to either engage them at a disadvantage or allow the attacks on ground forces to continue. It was sound, tactical thinking that put Lydia in a difficult position. She could attack the two fighters, but they were positioned to provide mutual support and had chosen an area with favorable defensive terrain. Alternatively, she could allow them to attack ground targets while she dealt with the remaining scattered German aircraft, but this meant accepting casualties among Soviet personnel. The decision was made easier by radio communications from the ground. White Lily. German fighters are attacking medical facilities and supply depots. Immediate assistance requested. Lydia began her approach to engage Berg and Hoffman, knowing that this would be her most dangerous engagement yet. Two experienced pilots in mutually supporting positions, alert and prepared for combat, represented a significant challenge even for a pilot of her capabilities. Her approach strategy relied on speed and surprise angle rather than stealth. She dove from maximum altitude at full power, building speed that would allow her to engage briefly and escape before the German pilots could coordinate an effective response. The risk was that high-speed engagement left little time for accurate shooting. Berg spotted her approach first. Hoffman, Soviet fighter diving from high altitude. Brake left and climb when I engage. The German pilots executed their planned response perfectly, with Berg turning to meet Lydia's attack, while Hoffman positioned himself to catch her in a crossfire as she pulled through the engagement. It was a classic defensive maneuver that should have resulted in either shooting down the attacking aircraft or forcing it to break off without achieving effective results. However, Lydia had encountered similar tactics before and developed her own counter-responses. Instead of pulling through the engagement as expected, she maintained her diving attack longer than normal, passing below Berg's aircraft and using her speed to climb rapidly behind Hoffman before he could complete his positioning maneuver. The result was that she engaged Hoffman from behind and below while Berg was out of position to provide immediate support. Her climbing attack caught Hoffman's aircraft with a long burst that destroyed his tail assembly and punctured his fuel tank. The Messerschmitt burst into flames and began its final descent. Berg immediately reversed his turn to attack Lydia, but she had already used her climbing speed to gain altitude advantage. The veteran German pilot found himself in the unusual position of fighting an opponent who held both positional and tactical initiative. All Eagle aircraft, the Soviet fighter has just shot down Hoffman. I am engaging, but I need immediate support. Berg transmitted while maneuvering desperately to avoid Lydia's follow-up attack. The remaining German pilots attempted to respond to Berg's call for assistance, but they were scattered across several miles of airspace and required time to reach the engagement area. Time that Berg didn't have, as Lydia pressed her attack with methodical precision. Berg was an exceptional pilot with over 40 combat victories, but he had never faced an opponent who combined such aggressive tactics with tactical intelligence. Every maneuver he attempted seemed to be anticipated and countered before he could complete it. Lydia's final attack on Berg came from an angle that violated standard fighter tactics but maximized her aircraft's specific performance characteristics. The Yak-1 could maintain control at low speeds better than the Messerschmitt, allowing her to execute a tight spiral that brought her guns to bear while Berg's aircraft was unable to match the maneuver. Her shells struck Berg's fighter in the engine and cockpit, causing immediate structural failure. The veteran pilot transmitted his final message as his aircraft began its terminal dive. Eagle leader. The Soviet pilot is unlike anything we've encountered. Recommended immediate withdrawal and request for additional squadrons. 6 German fighters eliminated in less than 15 minutes. The remaining pilots were scattered, demoralized, and facing an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move. Squadron leader Muller faced the unthinkable reality that his elite squadron was being systematically destroyed by a single enemy pilot whose capabilities exceeded every expectation. The mission that had begun with casual confidence was becoming a nightmare that would haunt German aviation planning for months to come. As Lydia positioned herself to engage the remaining aircraft, the sky over Stalingrad had become a graveyard of German tactical assumptions and underestimated opponents. The final phase of the engagement began with 6 German fighters scattered across the battlefield and squadron leader Müller facing the most difficult decision of his military career. Half of his elite squadron had been destroyed or severely damaged by a single opponent whose identity remained unknown. Radio communications revealed the growing panic among his remaining pilots. Eagle leader. Request permission to disengage and return to base. Transmitted Lieutenant Kruger, whose aircraft had suffered minor damage from debris during one of the earlier engagements. We are not equipped to handle this level of opposition. Müller's training and experience told him that withdrawal was the logical choice. The primary mission had become impossible, his formation was scattered and demoralized, and continuing the engagement would likely result in additional losses. However, military protocol and pride demanded that he attempt to salvage something from the disaster. Negative Eagle flight. We regroup and eliminate this fighter before withdrawal.
"Form up on my position for coordinated attack," he ordered, though his voice carried less conviction than at the beginning of the mission. Lydia monitored these radio transmissions with growing tactical awareness. The remaining German pilots were attempting to reform their scattered formation, but their coordination was hampered by fear, confusion, and the psychological impact of watching experienced colleagues get shot down. More importantly, their fuel consumption during high-power combat maneuvering would soon force them to choose between continued engagement and safe return to base. Her own situation was becoming critical as well. Ammunition was running low after 6 intense engagements. Fuel consumption had been heavy, and her aircraft showed minor damage from defensive fire during the last attack. Most significantly, she knew that additional German formations might be responding to the distress calls from Mueller's squadron. The tactical mathematics favored a defensive strategy: maintain altitude advantage, avoid direct engagement, and allow the German fighters to exhaust their fuel, while preventing them from attacking ground targets. However, Lydia's combat instincts suggested a different approach. The psychological momentum was in her favor, and the German pilots were making increasingly desperate decisions that created opportunities for decisive action. As the surviving German aircraft attempted to form up around Mueller's position, Lydia noticed that their formation discipline had deteriorated significantly. Instead of the precise tactical spacing they had maintained at the beginning of the mission, they were flying too close together for mutual protection while remaining too far apart for effective coordination. She decided to exploit this weakness by attacking the formation's most vulnerable aircraft while using the poor spacing to limit their ability to provide mutual support. Her target was Lieutenant Richter, flying slightly ahead of the main formation as he attempted to rejoin from his isolated position. Richter was an experienced pilot, but the stress of watching half his squadron get destroyed had affected his judgment. He was flying predictable patterns while focusing too much attention on the main formation rather than scanning for threats. When Lydia began her attack approach, she remained undetected until the final seconds. Her attack came from below and ahead, using the sun's position to mask her approach until she opened fire at close range. Richter's first indication of danger was the sound of cannon shells striking his aircraft's wing root and fuselage. The damage was immediately severe, destroying hydraulic systems and puncturing fuel lines. "Eagle leader, this is Eagle 9. I am hit and losing hydraulic pressure." Soviet fighter engaged from below, Richter reported as he struggled to maintain control of his damaged aircraft. The remaining German pilots turned toward the engagement, but Lydia had already disengaged and was climbing rapidly to avoid their converging attack. Richter's Messerschmitt began trailing fuel and smoke as he attempted an emergency landing procedure. Squadron leader Mueller watched his 7th pilot go down and finally accepted the reality of their situation. They were facing an opponent whose capabilities exceeded anything in their training or experience. Continuing the engagement would result in the complete destruction of his squadron without achieving any military objective. All Eagle aircraft. This is Eagle leader. We are withdrawing immediately. Form loose formation and maintain defensive spacing during egress, he ordered, abandoning any pretense of completing the original mission. However, Lydia had no intention of allowing the surviving German fighters to escape and potentially report detailed intelligence about her tactics and capabilities. As the German aircraft began their withdrawal toward friendly territory, she positioned herself to attack their formation one final time. Her strategy was to force the German pilots into individual defensive maneuvers that would scatter their formation and create opportunities for additional engagements. By attacking from multiple angles in rapid succession, she could simulate the presence of several fighters while actually fighting alone. The final engagement began with Lydia attacking the rear aircraft in a withdrawing formation, forcing the pilot into evasive maneuvers that broke formation discipline. As other German pilots turned to assist, she disengaged and immediately attacked from a different angle, creating the impression of coordinated multiple attacks. Lieutenant Bauer, flying rear guard for the withdrawal, became the target of her first pass. His aircraft suffered damage to the tail and elevator controls, forcing him into an emergency descent, while the other pilots attempted to provide cover. However, their defensive maneuvers only created additional opportunities for Lydia to exploit. Multiple Soviet fighters attacking from different directions, Bauer transmitted inaccurately as he struggled with his damaged aircraft. Request immediate support from additional squadrons. This false assessment of multiple attackers further demoralized the remaining German pilots, who now believed they were outnumbered rather than outclassed. Squadron leader Mueller attempted to maintain formation discipline, but his pilots were making increasingly desperate evasive maneuvers that prevented effective coordination. Lydia's final victim was Oberleutnant Zimmer, whose aircraft was caught in a climbing turn as he attempted to gain altitude advantage over what he believed were multiple attackers. Her accurate gunnery destroyed his engine and fuel system, sending the Messerschmitt into its final dive toward the ground below. With 8 of his 12 aircraft destroyed or severely damaged, Squadron Leader Mueller abandoned all tactical considerations and ordered maximum speed withdrawal to friendly territory. The surviving pilots scattered in individual escape attempts, abandoning formation flying entirely in their desperation to avoid further combat. All stations, this is Eagle Leader. Mission abort. Repeat, mission abort. Proceeding to emergency landing sites. Soviet air defense is far stronger than intelligence indicated. Mueller transmitted, providing a face-saving explanation for the disaster that avoided mentioning a single enemy pilot had destroyed his entire squadron. As the surviving German aircraft disappeared toward their territory, Lydia conducted a final assessment of the engagement area. 7 German fighters lay scattered across the countryside in various states of destruction, while wreckage from an 8th marked the crash site of the pilot who had attempted emergency landing.
Her own aircraft had sustained minor damage but remained fully operational. More importantly, she had achieved something unprecedented in aerial warfare. A single pilot had engaged and defeated a formation of 12 elite enemy fighters, fundamentally altering the tactical balance in the sector. The radio crackled with transmissions from Soviet ground forces who had witnessed the aerial battle. White Lily, this is ground control. Magnificent work. German ground attack has been completely prevented, and enemy air superiority has been eliminated for this sector. As Lydia turned toward her home base, she reflected on the engagement with professional satisfaction rather than personal pride.
The tactics had worked perfectly. German overconfidence had been exploited systematically, and a significant military objective had been achieved. More importantly, the psychological impact of this victory would influence German planning for months to come. The landing at her home airfield was routine, but the reception was anything but ordinary. Ground crews, pilots, and commanding officers gathered as word spread about the impossible aerial victory.
Sergei, her mechanic, examined the aircraft with professional interest while shaking his head in amazement.
7 confirmed kills in 1 engagement, he mused. The German pilots probably never understood what happened to them. Major Volkov approached with a mixture of admiration and disbelief.
The intelligence reports are going to be difficult to believe.
A single pilot against 12 experienced enemies? Lydia smiled as she completed her post-flight inspection. They expected to find easy targets and minimal resistance. Instead, they encountered prepared defenses and tactical intelligence. The outcome was predictable once they made their initial assumptions. As news of the engagement spread through Soviet military channels, Lydia Litviak's reputation was transformed overnight from promising pilot to legendary ace. The woman who had been dismissed by German intelligence as a minimal threat had proven that underestimating opponents could be a fatal mistake. The German pilots who survived the encounter would carry the psychological scars of their defeat for the remainder of the war. Squadron Leader Mueller's after-action report would be studied by Luftwaffe tacticians trying to understand how their most elite pilots could be systematically defeated by an unknown opponent. But perhaps the most significant impact was the message sent to both sides. In aerial combat, assumptions about gender, age, or experience could be more dangerous than enemy bullets. The sky above Stalingrad had become neutral territory where only skill, intelligence, and determination mattered. 7 German jets had fallen from the sky that day, victims not of superior technology or overwhelming numbers but of a pilot who understood that warfare was ultimately about intelligence triumphing over assumption, preparation defeating complacency, and individual excellence, overcoming collective arrogance.
The enemy had thought she was an easy mark. Instead, they discovered that easy marks don't exist in real combat, only unprepared opponents who mistake confidence for capability. Lydia Litviak had taught them that lesson with deadly precision. 1 fallen aircraft at a time.
The enemy thought she was an easy mark, then 7 jets fell from the sky.